All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Parker, and I'm a member of the marketing team at the Perry Johnson Companies, and I'll be helping to facilitate today's webinar and offer support to our speaker. I'm also joined by Commercial Manager of Food Safety and Supply Chain, Chris Reno, who's here with us. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our host, Dr. Spink, and we're going to get started.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good day. I'll first hand it over to Chris for some introductory statements.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We've got a really exciting presentation. Please stick around, put any questions in the chat box on the right side of your screen. At the very bottom, you'll see both questions and chat. Chat will be visible by everyone, and questions will be directed to the speakers. Have a great afternoon.
All right, well, thank you. I first off want to thank PJR as for the opportunity. I think this is probably my 10th or 15th webinar for you. It's been great. It's great to hear from everybody. It's really always exciting to see what you've got going out in the real world, because hey, you know, most of the time I'm sitting here in academia and away from everything going on. What's interesting to say, this is an exciting topic. I guess it's exciting if we're in it. And I teach undergraduate students here in the business college, and I tell them I might have a warped view of what is fun or exciting, but if you're in the food industry and you're the packaging industry, this is a hot topic. One thing that's unique about fraud is that gets the criminal aspect into it. So there's always something more maybe exciting about that. You can just see that by how many TV shows are about detectives or murders or crime or things like that. And so it does have some aspect to that. So just to start out a little bit about me, John Spink. I'm director of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy. I'm also an assistant professor in the Department of Supply Chain Management. That's in the Business College at Michigan State. That's unique because a lot of the people that work in this space are in the food science departments or information technology. So I'm really looking at it from the end of business decisions. And that changes things a little bit. We've got different things we can interact with. So for me, you know, my day-to-day is dealing with chief supply chain officers or chief procurement officers, and them dealing also with the C-level of companies. And so it's really different to look at this as a supply chain disruption. Also, just when I talk about packaging, some people know me more from the fraud side or crime side, but actually my PhD is in packaging. And I worked for 12 years before coming back to MSU and got my PhD in packaging. MSU is the only university in the world that has PhDs in packaging. And I'm the 34th PhD in the history of the universe. So I've got some unique contribution for you here from that as a background. So we're going to look at an update on the GFSI related food fraud compliance for packaging suppliers. Now it's kind of a mouthful there, but one thing that's really key is that GFSI is the benchmark for food safety audits, pretty much, and GFSI also considers laws and regulations. And so most likely the GFSI compliance requirements are ones that will also help you be compliant with the wide range of food laws around the world. And then we look at food fraud compliance for packaging suppliers specifically. Now, this is unique because, you know, most times the packaging supplier is not making the food, and you supply other industries as well. So there's some very specific requirements. This gets sometimes to feel extremely complex, but we'll try to break it down to some really simple actions for you. So first, one thing to do is give you support. So these are all free open online courses. We've taught them since 2013. Makes me start to feel old. Actually, I wrote up a presentation and I was talking about things that happened in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. It seemed like that's so long ago, but also it seems like it was just so recent. But so some of these things have been around for a while. And again, overviews, audit guide, looking at food defense. We have at the bottom there, interesting, is USDA, National Organic Program. There's some courses there. Those are for USDA inspectors, but that applies to everybody, especially people that are getting audited. And then we have two new ones, procurement and advanced criminology. And advanced criminology is especially interesting. My mom is 86 and she loves this stuff because it's crime, it's international intrigue. but that one advanced criminology was developed for Operation Opsin members, and that's Europol and Interpol worldwide. That gets into the crime aspect of it. Might be overkill, is overkill for packaging, but you've got some options there. Again, a lot of resources. If you want to go deep, you can find them, as well as actually some old dates, executive education and professional development if you need more. So just to real quick, if you do get confused or concerned, there's a lot of resources. PJR has a lot of ways to help you. We have a lot of these different courses. We have actually our MOOCs are going back to offer a live version. So here at the end of March, mid-March, we're going to have live sessions. We're splitting up the supply chain MOOC and the audit guide MOOC. Those are 4 hours a piece, so there's 2 hours each. So that's a way to look at the supply chain management and the audit guide. The key with the audit guide, if you're a packaging company, is that this is how people like PJR and others would audit you and review you. So that's there as an option. That's online. And then also professional education. Really the executive education that we did. Save the date. We've got packaging compliance for the packaging suppliers, and this is a couple days. The workshop. It'll be East Lansing and hybrid. That's actually the week after the Food Safety Summit. So if you're already traveling and gone, then maybe you can be a part of that too. So there's a lot of resources for you, again, from the PGR side and us from the more education side. So why you care? So you're a packaging supplier. Hey, you're just selling the packages, right? You know, one day you're talking to a food company, sometime you're talking to somebody else. Why you care is these are compliance and customer requirements. Specifically, we'll look quickly at the McDonald's supplier quality management system and show where packaging fits in. And again, this is reminding you some key concepts. So why you care is number one, if you sell packaging into the food industry, you are in the food industry. And you might think, nah, whatever, he's just talking, but you are subject to the food laws and regulations, and that's a real key. The key with that is that if there's a problem and there's anything related to the package, your product, not complying is often criminal. The Park Doctrine is the one that would hold the CEOs accountable if whatever happens. It's strict liability. And the other is if you don't have a plan in place, if you haven't conducted the assessment, then it could be criminal. Now, what's the % chance that someone has a food safety incident from a package that leads to a death, that leads to criminal prosecution? Bottom line is when we talk to CFOs and CEOs and general counsels, they don't want to risk it. They don't want to roll the dice. And the key is we'll look at here the real core of what you need to do to actually be compliant. So we'll get into it. So this is looking at the McDonald's document under food safety. You'll notice that down there, food safety and quality management systems are a requirement. And here's the key for us, all applicable laws and regulations. So in this is all hazards from, say, the Food Safety Modernization Act or Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act in the US, all hazards are something that need to be assessed. That could include from packages. But the bottom line, let's look at McDonald's first, instead of really looking at the laws or having lawyers interpret it. What does McDonald's say exactly? So again, that you've got to have a food safety management system and it's compliant with all laws. Some or all. It does not just say a few of them, doesn't say a couple of them, doesn't say just the US ones, it's all laws. And what is a food safety management system? That's something we'll look at GFSI for that guidance. So again, a packaging company would have such much infinitely lower requirements and concerns than, say, a company with leafy green vegetables, but bottom line is still need a food safety management system. So in that food safety management system requirement is item 6.5, food fraud prevention. It's absolutely positively 100% included. It is explicit. The word is there, and not only food fraud, but prevention. So it is definitely a requirement. So what does McDonald's say about food fraud prevention? And here's a key where we drill in to say, what do you need to do as a packaging company? So what they do say here is suppliers shall perform a risk analysis on ingredients and raw materials. So if you're making plastic bottles, that means you're looking at resin. You're looking at the boxes you use to assure compliance to food safety quality requirements, which probably they are, but probably they are isn't confirming that they are. And the threat of food fraud. Right there is the key, is that it's absolutely there to avoid food fraud. It's in there, it's written. Yes, it's only 43 of 6,600 words. That's so small, but it's still a requirement. So we're going to try to walk you through the simplest ways to start meeting that compliance. And it can be simple. Hopefully we've done a good job, again, with people like PJR to simplify this, to boil it down to what you need to do for your products. And right there is then into the prevention strategy to reduce or eliminate the risk. And it shall be implemented, and a vulnerability assessment shall be documented. So right there, again, you could debate GFSI's interpretation, my interpretation, PJR's interpretation, but you can't, this is directly there, it's expected. Now, how often will this be a problem for you? Well, let me tell you, if you do have a food fraud incident, they're going to go back and look at this to confirm whether you have done this or not. Now, that's also parallel to what a government agency would do, and that's at the point where it starts to be possibly criminal. So bottom line is, that's the scare tactics a bit, but we want to just get you to the point where you realize you got to do it, and the question gets to be, so what do we do now? And just here, don't forget food fraud, and don't forget food defense. And just to clarify before we get going, does McDonald's really believe food packaging is in there? Absolutely, and it's written right there in their section 9.8 under food fraud, food packaging, clearly there. And so that's just absolutely there. So GFSI a little bit. Let's see what they said to get us started a little bit to see the big picture. So this is GFSI's guidance document, their position paper. Food fraud, including subcategory of economically motivated adulteration, is of growing concern. It is deception of consumers using food products, any food products, ingredients, and packaging. So again, we're hitting you again, right straight up that, yeah, packaging is involved, packaging is included, and it's not implicit, it is explicit. The word right there is packaging. For economic gain includes the definitions of food fraud in there. So packaging absolutely is required. Again, this is something that those McDonald's auditors, GFSI auditors, and others should be asking packaging companies about this. And the food companies that you sell packages to, if they're not asking you yet, they're going to ask you more often, because again, it's really something that's raising on the awareness. So kind of a heads up there on that. As well as looking at the overall vulnerabilities in the supply chain, is that absolutely packaging and labels for the ingredients, products coming in are key. At the other end is something different, repackaging. So that's looking at this as saying, is this the package or it's the packaging, operations? And so repackaging is an area where fraud can occur as well. So let's say that you're buying bulk product and you're breaking it down, or you're making smaller size packages or specialty packs or holiday packs. That repackaging is an area that's of concern as well. So that could be the difference between the package itself and the operations of packaging. So it's definitely there, listed, and a part of the concerns. So we're going to look at specific. The thing that we're trying to do is really drill in to look at those base requirements to understand what it is you actually need to do. And a key there is that once you realize what you need to do, then you can leverage the wide range of resources and services and support to achieve that goal. Now, again, if you do it for a package company, this assessment and this prevention plan is going to be exponentially smaller than say for a food company or a yogurt company, but you still need to do the base process steps. So we're going to refine it down so you see from those bigger systems what you need to do, and it can be pretty simple. So first off, what is the packaging and what is packaging? So from GFSI, the package is the container, and packaging is the process of filling the package. Just important to clarify. Sometimes if you say we've got all these bottles, that's the packaging, then technically we should call that the package or those packages. Who's responsible for what? So we've got different actors involved. So if you're the package seller, it's different than if you're the package buyer. Now, a lot of times the buyer can also be the user, but say it's a purchasing group that buys the product for corporate, and then a division or an operating company uses the product. Each of the entities has a responsibility. That seller is confirming that the product does meet all these certifications. The buyer is supposed to be checking on the supplier. Ask them and confirm. You'll see at the last slide is a set of questions and a little gap analysis, something you can use just to start the process. And the user there probably is just getting product from the buyer, the internal procurement group, and they just should not adjust the product when they receive it. The requirement is HACCP, TACCP, and VACCP. That's for food safety. HACCP is for food safety overall, TACCP is threat assessment for food defense, and VACCP is the vulnerability assessment. And that's what we'll start to get into here in a little bit. We'll look at more details. So the scheme or scope, so overall GFSI, what are the key elements to look at? So first off, we're looking at this whole idea of the production of food packaging. So right there is interesting, production of food packaging. That's making the food packages, and that includes the logistics and distribution of getting that to you. So again, this is a specific section in section M in the GFSI guidance document. The requirements for the food safety management system to be in place in the scheme standard for GFSI scope recognition food packaging. The requirements for the GFSI, the good practice requirements to be in place in the scheme standard. It's here in, again, production of packaging again. And then again, the requirements for HACCP or HACCP-based requirements to be in place in the scheme standard GFSI scope of recognition for those production of food packaging. So bottom line there, it's absolutely a requirement in there. Now we go into the details of what does this look like. So when we look at the scope, saying what are these products, services, and methods of production for food packaging? Production of food and feed packaging. So that could be even feed packaging. I don't know if you have a division that makes bags or boxes or whatever for feed, animal feed, then that's required as well. And why would they do that? Because you're feeding the animals that will then become human food. Packaging materials. It's absolutely written there positively. Packaging components in the form of a lot of things, raw materials, parts processed, semi-converted, converted. They do have a pretty substantial list there. That's really key to remind you that any packaging coming into a company is required to have this plan. So let's look a little further about the individual roles of the different entities or different players. First is the package seller. So in the food safety management section there on that, the packaging materials, the general requirements, they shall ensure that the packaging used it will have the functional effect on food, such as shelf life, shall, where known, be effective within its own specified criteria. That's a lot of big words, but the key, what they're looking at is that it's going to do what it says it's going to do. That's even the performance. That's not just saying that you handled the package properly, saying the performance is there. And really what we've got is, just like with any food ingredient, you've got the same requirements. HACCP also includes quality control for food safety. Then you've got TACCP for food defense and VACCP. And two parts of that. Action one is to have an assessment, and action two is to have a plan that where you implement it. Now, a lot of times with food packaging, let's say it's a bottle that's being blown, put right into a package, shrink wrapped, goes right to the supplier. There's very, very little chance for any type of food safety issue to occur. You still need to do the assessment to confirm that. And then the plan in that case would just be to review it. Now, if it does go outside or something like that, or birds might fly over or something, or dust could get on it, dirt could get on it, rain could get on it, then the assessment would show that as a vulnerability, and you have a plan to monitor or test or change the system. Now let's look at the scope for the package buyer. So just because you're buying product, doesn't mean you are free from doing anything here. But it's a little bit simpler. So from purchasing, it does say that, the standard shall require the organization controls the supply management processes for all externally sourced materials and including packaging materials. And again, the next line down, there's including the food fraud mitigation requirements. So the key is the buyer needs to confirm that the suppliers are following these parts of the standard. Second is, from non-approved suppliers, is acceptable in emergency situations, but you still need to do the assessment. So even if you run out of product, you buy some spot product, and that product comes in, if that supplier doesn't do the food fraud or food safety plan and assessment, you need to do it. And that's a real. Let's say that you buy cartons from a company that's not usually a food company, but so they'd be a non-approved supplier. You hadn't audited them, but everything, it's the same spec, the same specification as the cartons you use. If you buy from them and they don't have a food safety plan in place, you're required under GFSI to conduct those assessments. And you as the buyer could lead to your company not meeting the GFSI food safety certification. You could cancel, you could miss an audit, you could lose your certification for the buyer not confirming from that spot supplier. So there's some real key actions here. And then the third stakeholder is the user. And so it's not specifically defined in these parts, but the big key is that, let's say you're a manufacturing plant and your purchasing group buys the product, then your real role is, if you're looking at your food safety audit, your GFSI certification, you just confirm the purchasing group is doing all the things they're supposed to do. Now, if they do confirm that, then the key for you is just don't deviate from the plan, don't modify the product at all. And that in and of itself is a data point. I constantly tell students that even if you do an assessment and you don't find any information, that's a data point. There's not any information there. So the key is for the user just to not deviate from the product or not modify the product when they receive it. I want to just mention, sorry, that might have been a little loud. I want to just mention food defense, because a lot of times people focus only on food safety. Maybe they start to think about food fraud, but food defense is in here as well. And if you're going to start to look at the plan and the process for food fraud, it's really efficient. It's just a little bit extra work to apply it to food defense. The base processes of looking at an initial screening or the prevention plan, things like that, are very similar for food defense. So we can talk about that in more detail another time maybe, but that's a key. It's in there. They're basically parallel requirements. Food fraud requirements, these are directly from GFSI. Basically, the same text is in all of the, I think it's 13 or 16 sections of different products they have. Basically exactly the same. The requirements are, the most basic is number one, a documented fraud vulnerability assessment. Fortunately for you, there's a lot of training and resources and things like that. We have some free courses on that, public information, primer documents on the basics. S-Safe organization has some as well, the vulnerability assessment tool. There's a lot of things you can use. The key is that your likelihood and consequence, your incidences are going to be so much less than the regular food company, but it's still a requirement to have that document, and key is documented. Second one down there is the food fraud mitigation plan or prevention strategy. Again, documented. That in an audit, the auditor or your customer, they can ask you to show the document. Now, that's a key. Is it's one thing to say, oh, we reviewed it. Well, show me the document. Show me where you did it. And that mitigation plan or prevention strategy is really looking at the vulnerabilities from step one and saying, what do you put in place? Example for a food company would be like, let's say that it is blow molded bottles. You put them in they're palletized. You shrink wrap them. Well, maybe you look at it and say there's not actually a cap on it. It shrink wraps around the side. It's just maybe a fiber board at the top. Well, all of a sudden then that adds a vulnerability, like water could get on that for a food safety incident. So then you'd have a plan to say, well, let's go ahead and put a plastic cap on the top, and that would then stop it. The other would be like on a production line. If birds could get inside the facility and fly around, then bird droppings could get on the package. Then maybe you put a little hood over the or a tunnel over the product so bird droppings couldn't get on it. That's where you'd have the vulnerability, and then you'd implement a plan. And then over time, you just monitor if anything's changed. That's a key. And then finally, it's just a reminder that the food safety or food fraud and food defense actions have to fit into the food safety management system. This is not a one-off separate activity. It's got to be connected in there. And that's really straightforward. Once you finish number one and number two, a lot of us can show you how to just do that. So that's what the requirements are, and the big picture is how do you meet them. So to step back a little bit, GFSI talks about these three types of assessments. So food fraud is separate. It's got to be a separate one. It's actually simpler to do it this way. If you tried to expand the food safety assessments or the food defense assessments to fraud, it just gets to be so complex. It's easier to think about them in separate categories. So you have this separate type of assessment. And as I mentioned before, the GFSI requirements are straightforward. This is some text directly from their site. And what we've got overall is there's basics, the overall concepts. You need to do a vulnerability assessment. You need to have a prevention strategy. Even if that strategy is only to monitor any changes, that's still a strategy. And then there's some details. Now, beyond GFSI, if you sell to McDonald's, like I mentioned, they'll have some additional requirements. If this is BRC, FSSC 22000, IFS, SQF, or whoever, they'll have some specific details. Now, something I want to mention before just looking at the overall questions of like gap analysis questions is to say, just to remind you that even though you find new vulnerabilities, that doesn't mean that every one of those new vulnerabilities needs a control plan. It's not like basically you've got vulnerabilities. That's just a system weakness. A bird could fly in the building. And then you've got risks. The risk or hazard could be that a droppings could occur. And then you've got hazards that require preventive control using the FSMA type terminology. So just because you have a vulnerability doesn't mean you have a hazard that requires a preventive control. You actually want to find as many vulnerabilities as possible, because then you're at least considering them. You have them on the list of things that you're considering, and you did an assessment and realized that, hey, a bird flying in and have droppings on the package is not gonna be a problem. Well, maybe next year it is. So maybe next year a door had been open all summer and birds were flying in. In the past, something that was interesting was species swapping in meat. So horse meat and beef was not a problem until it was a problem. So a lot of companies had it on their list of vulnerabilities. It wasn't yet really a hazard or a risk, but they had on their species swapping. So some of them saw species swapping come up very early, and they changed their control plans. At that point, looking at that vulnerability led you to be more aware of it. Example I like to use also is a meteor. So let's say that a meteor hitting your manufacturing plant. Is it a vulnerability? Yes. If it hits, the consequence is horrible, even if it's a tiny meteor. And so yes, okay, the likelihood of that is very unlikely, but the consequence is absolutely immense. Now let's look at the combination of those. So one thing to consider is that vulnerability of you getting killed by a meteor strike where you're sitting right now, the likelihood is so low. Now before thinking about whether that's acceptable or not, or whether you should try to prevent it or not, let's think about the risk treatments. So what would you have to do to build a manufacturing facility that was resistant to a meteor strike? Let alone, I mean, if it's all of a sudden a meteor of any size, then you'd be miles underground. That would be very, very impractical. So that's a key when we look at this, to think you want to look at vulnerabilities, and don't be afraid to identify vulnerabilities. Just quickly understand that likelihood and consequence, or if there's some simple things you can do to avoid it. So again, hitting by a vulnerability is hitting by a meteor is a vulnerability, but we're not really going to worry about it. So what do? What's the starting point? So what we've got here is to start out by looking at basically a set of questions. And this is a great way to start out for you if you're asking your packaging suppliers, or if you are a packaging company. And these are all public things like that. So have they conducted a food fraud vulnerability assessment, or have you conducted a food fraud vulnerability assessment? Most likely you haven't, but maybe you have. So yes or no. Is it written? Right there's a big deal. Remember, documented is a real key requirement all along the way. So like, again, if you're a buyer and you could ask your supplier, have you conducted a vulnerability assessment, yes or no? Can you show me the document? Maybe they don't show you everything, but they've got to give you some level of comfort that they've got things under control. Have they implemented a food fraud prevention strategy? Now, early on, I asked a group of very senior leaders, a group of food safety VPs, do you have a food fraud prevention strategy? And one of them said, oh yeah, we do. And then I said, can I read it? They said, oh no, it's not written. Well, then that's more aspirational. Again, the food fraud prevention strategy for a packaging company might just be continue to review food fraud vulnerabilities. So if just once a year you step back and look at it and do some internet searches, check with some experts, things like that, look at industry information, then you have a strategy. At that point, if the vulnerability is so low that you haven't identified any real risks or hazards that require preventive controls, then you're just doing ongoing monitoring. That is still a strategy. The strategy at that point is to continue to monitor. Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review. Now, a lot of people met the GFSI requirements back in 2018 and didn't do anything since then. Because yes, they were compliant at the time, but they didn't add that separate Plan, Do, Check, Act process. And that's what we've got, things that are moving along. And then no, just a note, have you addressed all types of food fraud? And then have you addressed all types of incoming goods? And that's a real key. So there's other requirements or other links if you want more information. So look, what we've got here is a real simple way to start looking at the overall concept. So, I mean, this is just a yes or no set of questions. And remembering, if you're trying to get your company to understand if they need to act or that they do need to act, you can go back and look at those basic requirements for GFSI. If you're a seller, then you're realizing these things of what your customer is requiring. If you're selling to McDonald's, you could ask them, I've read your document. What do you expect? Can you give us some insight? If you're selling to a food company, if you're selling to a grocery store, you can then just start to ask that what their expectations are for them to be comfortable that you're compliant. And again, if you're a buyer of packaging, then these are really simple questions you can just share with your packaging suppliers. You probably have some listserv, shared list, things like that. Maybe different types of requirements, documentation, or record keeping systems. Then this is just a good simple way to ask yes or no questions. Now, before finishing, we have plenty of time for questions here. Is that, admittedly, there is a big criticism here, because the criticism is that some audits are just a checkbox. Did it? Check. Is that okay for food fraud? Is that okay for this stage right now? So let's say that you're a packaging buyer. And if you just send out to your suppliers a mandatory survey and they fill that out and they say, yes, we're compliant with everything. Is that okay for right now? Well, if that's the first time you're going out, then one thing I would agree that yes, it's okay. It's actually optimal. What we find is that when people when people ask that set of questions, then some people will just fill it out. Some sales rep will just go, yes, 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 submit. Now, usually what happens is that raises a lot of other questions. The formal and official process has started. There was one company I was dealing with that I got an urgent call because it was like a Thursday, and then their customer called and said, hey, you need to confirm all these things that you're compliant. They submitted it for the audit that was then on Friday, the next day. But then in the process was a senior manager sign off or compliance sign off. And the compliance group signed off on it, but said, hey, what are we doing here? Did you really do this? We need to have a meeting next week. And that's the key. By asking those questions, the simple yes or no questions, that's an official statement from the seller to the buyer. You're making a formal statement to your customer that you are compliant, and the official process has started. And just that yes or no question does lead to a series of other actions. You have to document it for the auditor. You have to create the document. You have to get approvals. And once later for that company, once it gets into their document compliance system, then there was a lot more oversight of that. So there we are. There's a brief overview of the GFSI packaging requirements. What we wanted to do is to look at getting your attention and clarifying what is required. And then once you realize that that this idea of having an assessment and also the prevention plan is required, that starts to just ask more questions about, like, how would you go find incidents? How would you review your own documents? And then later, you can find the type of resources that help you actually become compliant. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'm open for discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spink. Another great presentation today. We don't have many questions from the audience. I do have one question that came in. Obviously, the negative of this, if someone has a recall, and we hear a lot of conversation in the industry about the average cost for a recall. Yeah. Could you maybe break that down a little bit for the audience? Because I think that maybe that's something that, you kind of hear this number of 2 million to 5 million, and it really just seems, out of this world. So could you just talk a little bit about what a recall looks like, and maybe some of those unplanned costs that go along with that if they run afoul of, food fraud prevention.
Yeah. Well, and so food fraud. If there's a food fraud problem, then that is just that falls under normal recalls. It's a food safety incident. So let's say that product's in the marketplace and you can't, maybe one of the bottles had bird droppings in it. Well, you need to be able to either confirm that all the other bottles do not have bird droppings in it, or you need to act on it. Let's say from a food fraud perspective, let's say that you said that this plastic film had a certain permeability, or like it would be the carton that then has some problem. It was supposed to be a certain level of performance. If that product gets out, then the customer as well is making a statement. So, well, let's say that let's say that the carton is required to have virgin pulp paper in it, and all of a sudden you use reclaimed paper or recycled paper. All of a sudden that product gets to the market. That could be food fraud. It might be just a quality control problem that you didn't check, but some companies definitely would sell recycled product as virgin. So especially if it's a high quality virgin product. So that product gets in the marketplace. That package that's on the shelf has been approved and reviewed and tested for that current specification. If there's a different specification, it is no longer compliant. So what that could lead to is, let's say that you said that you sold that for a cereal box. All of a sudden that customer is got to recall all their product. You sold them $1 million worth of cartons. They put it in $20 million worth of product. And if you didn't sell them what you said you were going to sell them, they're going to come to you at minimum for the loss of product that they incurred because of your system weakness. And that's a key with packaging. You might not be selling them very much as a percentage of their finished product, but if you lead to a recall of finished product, so right there, your $1 million sale leads to a minimum of $20 million coming back at you. And on top of that, they're gonna probably also you're going to be liable for the costs of that recall, costs of destroying the product, because they can't just resell that product. It's now illegal in commerce. So just selling $1 million could very quickly lead to $20 million minimum. And that's where these problems just can absolutely compound. The other side of it is then that with fraud, especially, it raises another question. Where else might this have happened? So all of a sudden, then you may have a legal requirement, or your other customers, like that customer for the cereal boxes, just because it's one shipment of $1 million, they may go look at every other shipment that you sent to them. They're now worried about all that other product. So all of a sudden, you've got a lot of increased scrutiny, and that again can also be really costly. So from the legal liability side, at the general counsel level, there's absolutely awareness that you just don't want to recall. I think the important point is saying that if you sell product that's not under control, it could lead to a recall. Then from your customers, that should be enough to get the action in your company, because this is not like a meteor strike. It's not like you have to build a plant a mile underground. It's just doing some of these vulnerability assessments. So not only you say, I think the key is to say, hey, this could lead to a recall. Our food company is starting to ask about our GFSI type certifications, then, but quickly go in to say, but there's not that much we would need to do. And so if you already look at the resources, that's why we provide the resources. And PJR is a great partner for all of us on this. There's already a lot of resources. So hopefully you would tell them that you might not be required, or you might not be compliant, but there's these simple things you can do. You can pretty quickly get back to being compliant. So simple question, but a pretty complex answer.
That's fantastic. So we've got another question that just came in. I'm going to do my best here to ask this one. Does the definition of food fraud allow failure to gap for preventative measures to avoid microbial growth to be seen as infringement?
Okay, that's a complex question, and I'm not exactly sure of exactly what the question is. Let's look at a couple different ways. So there's some packages that do have coatings or treatments as antimicrobial, so that the bad bugs don't grow on the package. Usually it's not the inside, because like if you got a hot dog, there's a hot dog and then there's fluid and then there's the film on it. And really it's at that interface between the film, the oily film and the package where the microbes would grow. There might be water there might be air. And so a lot of times people put an antimicrobial film. So if that film doesn't meet the specification, number one, that's a specification problem. That is not what you agreed to sell. That could be quality control, that they just accidentally had a problem. That's one thing, but it could also be fraud. I mean, why wouldn't it? That's probably the most costly part of the packaging process. So if a plant manager is trying to increase their profits, maybe they just dial that down a little bit. The key with that is that's a fraud opportunity. That's the bottom line. Where there's a fraud opportunity, there's a fraud opportunity. So a question from the fraud aspect from the buyer of product would be, does that supplier, does the seller of product have a quality control plan in place to make sure that we're getting exactly what we ordered? Now, that can be put in place for quality control, but that quality control step of again monitoring the antimicrobial would also reduce the fraud opportunity. And that's a key. You get double win for that. Now, if the buyer is not so comfortable about your operations, maybe you're really low cost and they think you're a little sketchy, then they may decide they need to have the process step themselves to confirm how many ever loads, to confirm that the antimicrobial treatment is consistent with the specification. Again, that then for the food company, that would be a food safety, a food quality, and a food fraud prevention measure. Now, hopefully the supplier is so trustworthy and got things under control that the customer doesn't have to worry about that. Every time you add one of those costs of quality, it makes your company less trusted and less valuable in the eyes of the customer.
It's a fantastic answer. So the last question we've got, can you talk a little bit about the requirements of disposable packaging material as part of the overall food unit?
Well, yeah, okay. So the question being is that, hey, it's just a shrink wrap. It's just a bottle. What's the big deal? It's plastic. There's nothing in it. Bottom line, that's an ingredient. That is considered as an ingredient, and everything going into a food plant needs to be reviewed for food quality, food safety, food fraud, and that's just a requirement. And the key, I mean, fraud can occur in any way. It's amazing the ingenuity of the fraudsters. I mean, absolutely brilliant in the criminal mind. The things that people see, whether that's lightweighting product, whether it's again using a reclaimed product instead of virgin or vice versa. The bad guys are ingenious. So it doesn't really matter if it's disposable product. It doesn't matter from a fraud standpoint if it's internal, primary packaging, secondary, tertiary packaging. The key is that it's an ingredient coming in. You must conduct an assessment. You must have a prevention plan. So let's say that it is the outer wrap for a pallet, the shrink wrap on outer wrap of a pallet, and the package stays, the product in there is already packaged, already sealed. Well, that outer wrapping has a very, very low likelihood or consequence of causing a food safety hazard, and a very then low likelihood and consequence of a fraud act occurring. I mean, it's just shrink wrap. So in that case, you still need to conduct a vulnerability assessment and have a plan. But look, in that case, the likelihood is extremely low and the consequence is extremely low. So at that point, with a very low, on the heat risk map, you're not going to do anything with that other than later monitor. So once a year, you could say, hey, have we had any problems with shrink wrap? And then, and have industry, you could just get on the internet and search for that. Now, maybe sometime there was a carcinogen solvent that we used or something, or sometimes if there's a catalyst, that's a key. Is some products used for the food industry, there could be catalysts to make the plastic that could be carcinogen or harmful, not for human consumption. So a lot of times the food grade product requires something else. So along the way, there could be some type of contamination. But if you just once a year then go look at it for that item that's very low on likelihood and consequence, then you have a plan in place. So if the seller then asks you for the shrink wrap, are you GFSI compliant? you can say yes, because going down through the questions, yes, you've conducted a vulnerability assessment. Yes, it's written. It's just could be a Excel document that you saved. Yes, you have a prevention strategy. That could just be a Word document that you saved. That you do this incident review. You conduct an annual incident review. That could just be a few minutes. It covers all types of fraud, because you're just generally looking at all frauds, and covers all products. You're really just from all products standpoint would really mean just the shrink wrap you're selling them, but you're looking at your ingredients as well. So at that point, then you're really done. I think one thing that I do, I think the most valuable role I have is helping you be comfortable doing less. Because there's a feeling like, oh, it's got to be more important than this, got to be more detailed. But that's not the case. A lot of times it is very, very simple. And start with that simple documentation. Hey, like the McDonald's requirements I mentioned, then you can say, hey, here's my documentation. Is this what you expected? Does this meet your requirements? And that's great. Then someone like that will usually communicate to you that you are meeting the requirements, or they might have some other things that are more of a concern.
Fantastic. So I know in that example you used shrink wrap. How would that change if, back to the question, if it were, straws and juice, kind of, little juicy juice carton with a plastic straw that's fixed to the outside of the carton?
Yeah, well, the thing is, that's part of a food package, and that's a part of that actually. The shrink wrap or stretch wrap on the outside of a pallet, that never comes into primary contact with the food. So the straw in a kid's juice drink actually is a primary package, even though you think it's outside, because what do they do with the straw? They put it in the product. So actually that product is a primary packaging, and then secondary would be the little wrap around it as well. But because that's touching that part of the package that becomes a part of the primary package. So see, right there is you're deconstructing the product that you're selling to the supplier. So let's say you do sell shrink wrap or stretch wrap, and you sell those straws. That's a whole different story, again, because the straws are a part of the primary package.
Fantastic.
Great job, Chris. You just opened up a can of worms for everybody. They thought they were just fine about how light it was, and now they realize the straws are primary packaging.
Now we've got 37 more questions. No, I'm kidding. So really appreciate your time today. One thing that I would love for you to leave us with, I know in the past you've talked about some of the items to watch out for, new trends, maybe some things that you're seeing in the marketplace, you're hearing from CEOs about some of the latest counterfeit or fraudulent items that are making their way to the market.
Yeah, that's a tough question. What we have looked at is more like some of the big trends or things that are going on. As of late, really interesting is to see all the FDA talk and reviews of the cinnamon that was in kids' applesauce, and that had lead chromate in the cinnamon to make it basically look brighter, make it look like it's fresher. And so there's a lot of reports. FDA is looking into details of that. So it'll be interesting to see FDA's focus. The key is FDA already has all the laws in place, and they have all the requirements in place, to conduct hazard analysis. But that's going to be interesting to see about if there is a confirmation or reminder that even looking at food fraud within the FDA food safety laws are important. So we're monitoring that closely. I think the biggest thing is looking at inflation is still an impact for us, and inflation leads to people re-engineering their products or being under pressure. So that supplier, let's say the supplier of that kid's juice straw, that in the past you've reviewed it and there was never a problem because they used, say, virgin resin. They used resin directly from the supplier. Well, all of a sudden then maybe they start to use some scrap in there because they're no longer just throwing away the scrap or moving it on to something else. Maybe they're changing their operations. All of a sudden, then there could be some floor sweepings in there or other contaminants, other types of products that were not food grade that could get in that straw. That supplier might not know that that's something they shouldn't do, but you as a buyer of food will suffer the consequences. So I think that that's a key with inflation, that we need to constantly be looking at the vulnerabilities and then just reviewing what's going on. If you don't go look for the problems, you'll never find them. And we want to know before. You definitely want to know before. So let's say that you find out that there was a problem in the marketplace, or let's say that cinnamon, lead chromate and cinnamon. If you buy cinnamon, even though you don't buy from that same supplier or through that supply chain, we now know lead chromate was in cinnamon. So that's something to say, well, maybe we should check with our suppliers, let them know that we should be, we're concerned about it. The same with like the straws, if you're a packaging company, that all of a sudden to confirm with your suppliers, you understand that they're and appreciate that they're working hard to keep the costs low, to keep inflation down, to keep prices from rising for you. But as a reminder, this is still a food product. We're still under the food laws and regulations, and we expect that standard to stay high. So that's a big key. That goes back to the process. The process is having a vulnerability assessment, prevention plan, and then communicating that through that annual review to your suppliers.
Fantastic presentation as always. I want to thank you again for joining us today, Dr. Spink. Thank you to all the attendees. If you would please give us about 24 hours so we can process this, and then it will be available on YouTube as well as sent out to your email. If you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either the Perry Johnson team or Dr. Spink and the Food Fraud Prevention Academy. And then, as always, look for upcoming webinars in future lineups. The next one is going to be Tuesday, March the 12th with Wayne Williams. We're going to talk about validation versus verification in food safety and HACCP plans. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their time today and wish everyone a great rest of their week. And we'll look and see you on the next one. Have a great afternoon.